ipko hona tuk tuin ngo tikarak tuin aperigap ko ipko go pang ni na tuino kaki takang itun ngo laplo ni amakangyak sinang mo hiwana konga kanong lima ko tuk tuyamel rat pang nakalu tuyakangata ukwa hibang niya kavita alagap ko mana go mat ko ni ngatuk tuni pang nakalu tani miya nakayakang inapta no kakain mana ukay ihumagiyap lutik maliga kaona akasimang man no kakait may nakaya kakapti ko no ka nakapya huklo ati tao tayo takakak mata mikila ko ningan
time kati malirap ta tayo matap ko at siya inat ukaw haraniyak kabun
yaw na ako 1981 may kanok pinialang ming mga apta alang ko himalang maliw na 1981 80 mi una atulaw ka yaw tilog alla naktaw mat 79 ing nali koplo himalaki ka kalo ma una le koplo himangin tiya na main
tamat semua mikal ukaw ikakanak pin
tukihi mana unuk tukihi ito kang nakpat takanuna titrak ko tuki titak kalo kay tao tu yam malo tukihi sa to kakanak tulo amat et kanaya khimat changin ma honga tak bungala ka maunuk tamayang nakakalong ni kamalo titrakawing mitagana ni titakak matukihi ya to takanakalit
imbakanut kanga lalaw nakaluta ikiwag kana luta watcha o trang na ibu Maila udang migapta pianik palyala kapta pianak katin nata kamanit to amiutat amruday ko katima yaktok si malokitut katima bigini akaw nila akago 9:30 mo apan ngotay kanito kihibal darakta wing me tap ko Jones Cardi malo Jim Amperson naala pagkakayo la mata dahil kaway makoy galwak po nga inyong nik unutamat tap ko katimatilugit tao tuk tiniluk tana alo apta dai makago 7 momik padun nukut tao tuk tiyan na megapta mat na lawik dai jong
mat na lawik tao kaluk titaw yu lawakapta tukihingin nakpata ilang inuna tagwan ito kaplo na ay humatakagap ko wat sa okang na sangapoy ko lang na kanyang sinang mayutang.
Thanks very much, Jim, for coming out.
You're quite welcome. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, well, I was supposed to give you my microphone here, but thanks anyway. Dahil mapianik pala niya lakapta, inutya na ako sa kamanit to ami, akagutirang na ami yugut.
It's an irony of our profession, and we're all aware of it, all of us who sit on the floor of the House, I suppose including yourself, Mr. Speaker, that people only really begin to admit our qualities when we're on the way out. It's a kind of convention with which we are all acquainted, and when we hurl insults at each other, we know that in reality we have a fair amount, perhaps a great deal of admiration for people who, like ourselves, decided to ask Canadians in their constituency to support them in a task which is sometimes thankless and certainly always nearly exhausting. And we know that, that underneath the partisan that we must show, that there's a basic underlying admiration for each other, if only because we've agreed to serve our countries in the same way, in the same forum. And perhaps there's a lesson for those out there who always take all our insults seriously. And I was reading in some magazine a few weeks ago that the profession of politics is held in very, very low esteem by the people of our country, way below sportsmen and actors and everything else. And I suppose that may be the explanation of it. In a sense, we are paid to belittle each other, and the people who watch us may believe that we are doing it in a way which decreases the value of our service, of our profession. I would want to use this day and this occasion to say that is apparently not the case, and the warmth with which my friends and my opponents have given me their warm wishes today indicates that there is a great respect amongst ourselves for the basic cause that we're all serving, that of Canada. Je voudrais aussi remercier.
I would also like to thank, in particular, my colleagues, especially those from my province. They've always supported me. I would like to repeat what I said in caucus this morning, that I would always be ready to help in the fight to make Canada a strong and united land.
Well, now the question arises, what happens next? Among other things, Peter, Trudeau's resignation would appear to put off any federal election that the Conservatives may have been thinking about for the spring.
There's no doubt they were thinking about an early election, quite possibly in the early spring. It's off now for, I think, two reasons. First of all, to have an election, they would have needed prodding from the Liberals, either another non-confidence motion or whatever. That's not going to happen now. The Liberals, obviously, minus a leader, aren't going to try and provoke an election. And the second reason is the Liberals will have a leader in March. He'll come in with that new wave of popularity that traditionally comes with a new leader, and I'd be very surprised if the Tories would want to try and challenge the Liberals then. So I think it's off for at least a year, next fall at the earliest.
But the biggest and the most immediate question, of course, is the choosing of a new leader.
That's right. The leadership convention will be in March, and this weekend we'll likely know just when and where. It's a decision the national executive of the Liberal Party is expected to make when they meet in Ottawa on Saturday. As for candidates, well, no one is officially in the race yet, but there are some names to be watching. Going from west to east, Vancouver's Art Phillips, former mayor, now Liberal MP. Winnipeg's Lloyd Axworthy, another freshman MP who's made a good impression so far. Thunder Bay's Bob Andrus, a solid performer in the last Liberal cabinet and one who's kept that image in opposition. From Ottawa, Jean-Luc Pepin, former cabinet minister, former National Unity Task Force chairman, now on a political comeback. From Quebec, Francis Fox, the problems that led to his resignation as Solicitor General will haunt him, but aren't expected to stop him from making a bid. Jean Chrétien, the former finance minister, has a strong following in both English and French Canada. Alan McEachen, Atlantic Canada's leadership possibility, although at 58 he may be too old. But of course, two men are really the front runners. They're both former Trudeau finance ministers. They both quit politics once. But today, John Turner and Donald MacDonald didn't rule out the possibility of trying again.
Well, Mr. Trudeau and I had our legitimate differences. But I admire very much what I've always perceived to be his complete commitment to Canada as a country. And I said when he beat me at the leadership convention about 10 years ago that he was the most remarkable Canadian of his generation. That still holds.
What conditions would you require to be met before you would make a decision to challenge for the leadership?
I just told you that I spent the whole day trying to weave my way through a series of business and professional meetings. I haven't had an opportunity to think about the significance of what happened this morning.
But you never at any time have thought that what the conditions would be in order to run for such a position?
Well, I consider that to be a premature question.
I'm just going to take a fresh look at my situation and say, all right, I decided to leave public life 2 years ago. Is there any reason why I would change that decision?
But even to state that, you've revised your position of 2 years ago when you removed yourself from public life.
Yeah, and I've been quite categorical. I think I'd have to say that a number of people I respect, obviously my former colleagues, have been suggesting to me that I should be getting back in again, and rather than dismissing summarily the suggestion, I think it is valid that I should make a fresh examination.
But you do acknowledge that you've softened your position of 2 years ago.
It's not as hard as it was even last week.
Well, that's the big news in those two answers. John Turner is still talking like he has been for the last couple of years, but Donald MacDonald is very different than the way not only last week but just 2 days ago when he was saying he had no intentions at all of running for the leadership. He's still not saying he will, but it's certainly beginning to sound like he might. In the studio tonight, Knowlton has some guests.
Peter, we brought together several keen and close observers of the political scene to make some comments on the Trudeau resignation. First off, Dalton Camp, the former Conservative Party president and a current political writer. George Radwanski, biographer of Pierre Trudeau and editorial page editor of the Toronto Star. And David Lewis, former leader of the NDP. Mr. Lewis, picking up on that list that Peter was just talking about on potential Trudeau successors, what are your thoughts and comments and expectations?
Well, I must make clear first that I don't really care which one of them they choose.
Who would you rather have?
I don't think I would have a rather. I think Trudeau himself made the mistake of thinking that the man can change the party, and he found the party changed the man. So I'm not... However, I would think that the Quebec people are out, because Trudeau was a Quebecer. I would think that the Western people are too new. I would think Alan McEachern isn't likely to make it. And I would think that John Turner has made a lot of enemies by the way in which he left the cabinet. And I think that Donald MacDonald, therefore, starts off, as far as I can see the political scene, a little better off.
George?
Well, I would certainly agree on most of the other contenders being in a very difficult starting position, either by way of inexperience or age or running into the French-English succession. I wouldn't agree on MacDonald being the front runner at this stage. I would say that even though he's made enemies, at the moment John Turner would be the starting front runner, simply because the party is going to be in a sort of a sense of panic. What do? We've got no leader, we need a winner. Turner is manifestly available. MacDonald has pretty well let it be known until now that he didn't really want the job, wasn't interested. He's hedged that slightly now. I would say if he is to have a chance of being a contender, he would have to make a much more open move within the next week or two. Otherwise, the party will coalesce around Turner in such a way that no one can stop him. If MacDonald does come in, then it becomes at least a race between those two, and in those circumstances, almost anything can happen. Otherwise, it's a Turner runaway, I think.
Dalton, you've had some passing acquaintance with leadership conventions. What's your estimate?
Well, I think we really have to decide upon two possibilities. Otherwise, the Liberal Party is going to be without a possibility. And, of course, it's Turner and MacDonald. The obvious thing is that I think we all know that if Trudeau had a choice, or if the establishment around Trudeau had a choice, it would be MacDonald. As a matter of fact, you know, I believe that Trudeau has discussed this with MacDonald on a number of occasions. While MacDonald has never said no, he hasn't said yes, but he's saying yes tonight. But what the important thing is who is going to appeal most to Ontario. That's where the ball game is. And you have to say about Turner, if he comes in, that the delegate feeling and what George was mentioning of the rancor will matter less than what the voters think. So you poll Ontario, Turner is the man they want. You poll the West, Turner is probably the most popular Liberal in Western Canada.
He's the right
and if he wants it, he's going to be a damn hard man to stop.
I would say in MacDonald versus Turner, MacDonald would probably beat him because of party feelings.
David, you were saying about Turner was the right-wing choice in the Liberal Party?
Well, I think the Liberal Party has gone right-wing. I think it's the neoconservatism has touched it, including the time when Trudeau was its leader in the last few years. But I think Turner tends to be much more accepted by the business world and is right-wing.
You're saying then there are no sleepers out there?
There may be.
We don't know about that.
We don't know who's asleep out there.
The Liberal Party has had a habit in the past of bringing in leaders from somewhere out in left field, people who weren't readily identified certainly a year or two earlier. But when you're looking at a couple of months, the chances are that the players would have to be somewhere on the scene, whether in the caucus, in the cabinet, or among former prominent members of the party. A miracle from totally outside is a little less likely.
You know, all the names that have been mentioned, they all have some capacity. You know, it's not an arid field. The number of people, the people who have mentioned, they're all intelligent. But I think the political picture gives MacDonald and Turner the go.
Just quickly, Dalton, who would you feel the Conservatives would fear most?
Turner.
Turner?
Yes, I would think that, because the very things that David was mentioning. I mean, he does have a certain amount of appeal to the business element in Western Canada, in Ontario, and elsewhere.
Gentlemen, thank you very much, and we'll be back to you later.
The beginning of the end for Trudeau came about 9 o'clock on a warm spring night last May. There had been talk about whether he would go since then, especially talk about it among Liberal Party leaders. Today, Mike Duffy has been talking to those top Liberals all day for their reaction.
22nd.
Mike?
After 11 years in power, Pierre Trudeau's government is defeated. There are tears, and the muttering about getting a new leader for the Liberal Party begins. Over the summer, Trudeau grew a beard, he drove his sports car, and he traveled. Politics seemed to be the furthest thing from his mind. In fact, some of his closest friends say he had already decided that he would step down. After Labor Day, Quebec Liberal MPs met. They praised Trudeau but decided that Claude Ryan would have to be the chief spokesman for federalism during the Quebec referendum campaign. In mid-October, activist Liberals met in Winnipeg. There were enough Trudeau loyalists at the meeting to prevent a revolt, but it was clear leadership was on people's minds. With federal and provincial by-elections looming, Trudeau decided he had to get tough, and he began to call for the defeat of the Clark government. But while Trudeau's tough talk rallied the troops and helped stave off the dissidents, he did manage to anger British Columbia Liberals by going to a New York disco rather than a Vancouver policy conference. Trudeau's final test of the political waters came last weekend in Toronto. Accompanied by all of his political advisors, he spent the entire weekend at the Ontario Liberal Convention. There, he heard lots of talk about leadership, and that confirmed his view that he had to leave. On Monday night, Trudeau addressed a fundraising dinner in Toronto. Tuesday, he returned to Ottawa, where his aides told him that the party's national executive was unhappy with his failure to appear in Vancouver, and that they would likely vote to hold a party policy conference in March. At that conference, delegates would be asked if they wanted to review Trudeau's leadership. Because the conference would likely take place during the Quebec referendum campaign, many Quebecers would not attend. And Trudeau was told that he was almost certain to lose that important vote. He was also told that the party had done well in recent by-elections, and that this was his last chance to leave looking like a winner.
So, Mike, this was then an attempt by Trudeau to leave looking like a winner.
Exactly, Peter. He confirmed last night the decision that he had taken several weeks ago. In fact, the decision he made that night back in May. And he transmitted that decision, first of all, to his wife. He saw Margaret last night and told her of his plan to leave public life. Today, he told the Liberal Party president, Al Graham, Senator Dahlia Wood, who is the president of his riding association in Mount Royal. Then he told his staff, and then he walked across the street to the Liberal Party caucus. It was interesting because he sat in that caucus meeting and allowed a report to be given on the by-elections. The report which, in his mind, proved that the Liberal Party was alive and well and that Liberal fortunes were actually growing. Then, after that report, he stood up, picked up his statement, and began to read it. But he faltered. He choked up. He couldn't continue. And he left the room, tears in his eyes, as members of the Liberal caucus had tears streaming down their cheeks. Trudeau then came across the street here to the National Press Building, where he told us in Canada of his decision.
The interesting thing in that, Mike, is that what you're saying is most of his key staff members didn't really know until the last day or so. When in fact, I've been talking today to some of his close personal friends who, as we know, aren't necessarily his close personal staff members. They seem to indicate that the decision was made about 6 weeks ago, that he would leave, and it would be shortly after the by-elections. But the decision hinged mainly on the Quebec situation, on his desire to fight the referendum. But not only the referendum, apparently he has some indication that he may be fighting Claude Ryan as well. He's had an idea of Ryan's proposals that are due to come out in January. He's not that happy with them and felt that it would be easier to fight Claude Ryan as a former Prime Minister.
Exactly. Yeah.
And not as the Liberal leader.
Well, that's true, Peter. He is quite concerned about Claude Ryan, and some people say, who know him well, that Trudeau is in fact in some ways more concerned about Ryan and his views of Canadian nationalism than he is about René Lévesque. But your point is well taken. The fact seems to be that Pierre Trudeau decided 6 or 8 weeks ago to try and use the by-elections as a springboard so he could leave the leadership without looking like a loser. And so that's what he did. Today he's gone. We haven't heard the last of him, though. I think you're right. We'll see an awful lot of him in the province of Quebec.
Okay, Mike, thanks very much. Dalton?
Well, Peter, whatever his future, he was Prime Minister for nearly a dozen years, holding office longer than anyone except for Mackenzie, King, MacDonald, and Laurier. He swept into office on Trudeau-mania and was swept out of office by a disenchanted Canadian public. Ken Colby has his biographic look at Pierre Elliott Trudeau.
Pierre E. Trudeau, 1203. Canada must be unified. Canada must be one. Canada must be progressive. And Canada must be a just society.
Pierre Trudeau's rise to Prime Minister was rooted in the streets of Quebec, where the frustrations of French Quebecers were being paraded and demands for nationalism were growing louder and louder. It was 1964. In Ottawa, Lester Pearson was searching for strong Quebec Federalists who might one day succeed him as Prime Minister. He found two, Jean Marchand and Gérard Pelchet, and then, at their insistence, added Pierre Trudeau. Trudeau, the wealthy bachelor, was better known as a swinger in the clubs of Montreal than as Justice Minister of Canada. But 2 years later, when Pearson resigned, Marchand, the logical successor, shocked the Liberals by saying he wouldn't run.
I'm not a candidate. That's the first time I say it.
That left Trudeau as the only possible Quebec candidate, and Pearson pushed him front and center. Most Canadians' first impression of Trudeau came at a First Ministers' meeting when he faced down Quebec's demands for special status. Now Liberal leader and Prime Minister, Trudeau called an election, challenging Canadians to create a just society, rejecting special status for Quebec. On the eve of the election, the Saint Jean-Baptiste Society held its annual parade in Montreal. There was anger in the air because Trudeau had equated Quebec separatists with the assassins of Robert Kennedy. Trudeau held his ground and won the first majority government in a decade. He both fascinated and exasperated Canadians. He dated movie stars. He was an international celebrity, captivating crowds in London in a way their own Prime Minister couldn't. At home, civil servants stumbled through language training courses. Trudeau brought in the Official Languages Act and official bilingualism. He recruited French Quebecers into the senior civil service. He believed Canada had to demonstrate there was room for Quebec. October 1970. James Cross and Pierre Laporte were kidnapped. Troops were brought in to guard other potential victims.
Well, there's a lot of bleeding hearts around who just don't like to see people with helmets and guns. All I can say is go on and bleed, but it's more important to keep law and order in this society than to be worried about weak-kneed people who don't like the looks of a At any cost? At any cost? How far would you go with that? How far would you extend that? Well, just watch me.
To proclaim the War Measures Act. It did so at 4 a.m. this morning in order to permit the full weight of government to be brought quickly to bear. These are strong powers, and I find them as distasteful as I am sure you do.
A Gallup poll showed 86% of Canadians thought Trudeau had done the right thing. Canadians also approved when he married Margaret Sinclair of Vancouver. She would not, he said, be a public figure. A private life is private. In those years, Trudeau perplexed many Canadians. He was a strong man, probably a brilliant one. but he seemed isolated, removed, philosophic even about defeat.
Brother, someday we may be beaten, and I don't know what will happen, and if I am, what I'll do. The world is so full of a number of things, I'm sure we should all be as happy as king.
In 1972, he barely campaigned. He barely salvaged a minority government. Outside Canada, people couldn't understand it. His position as an international statesman was growing. Canada was the first country to recognize China. We were no longer bit players. We would take our place with the Big Six at economic summits. At home, Trudeau backed Robert Bourassa, and Bourassa crushed René Lévesque in the '73 Quebec election. Separatism, said Trudeau, is dead. The country was having serious economic problems, rising inflation and unemployment, but when the Conservatives suggested wage and price controls, Trudeau pounced. With Margaret beside him, Trudeau strode across the country, pouring scorn on controls, a disaster, he said, that would never be visited upon Canada. The country gave him his second majority government. Thanksgiving Day, 1975.
That this program must work, because if it does not, the government may be forced to impose mandatory, comprehensive, all-embracing price and income controls upon every man and woman in Canada.
That flip-flop on wage and price controls hurt Trudeau badly. He'd been disliked before, he'd been disagreed with before, but now he was being disbelieved.
We were against controls at the time of the last election. Then we flip-flopped, to use the popular expression, and brought in controls. Now, why did we lie to you? Unless we can explain that, you know, the people out there are right to be mad. Having tried to get voluntary restraint, because we didn't like controls and we know people don't like controls, and having failed, we brought out our contingency plan and applied it.
Other things were turning sour. A growing backlash against bilingualism found focus in a strike by air traffic controllers. Robert Bourassa, Trudeau's choice as Federalist champion, introduced Bill 22 to make French Quebec's only official language. An angry Trudeau flew to Quebec to denounce it.
One of my strongest criticisms isn't even one which gives rise to injustice. It's just what I call political stupidity. One of my strongest criticisms is that Bill 22 talks about French as the only official language of Quebec. You know, if they had only said the main language, the principal language, the working language, la langue nationale, it would have made things so much easier for us liberals and the rest of the country when we're saying to the rest of the country there are two official languages, French and English.
Then, October 1976. 8 years after Trudeau's won Canada, Quebec elected a separatist government. Some liberals believed this new threat would revive Trudeau's popularity, but as inflation and unemployment grew, others were afraid he'd be rejected as a one-issue prime minister. He built on his international reputation, visiting Jimmy Carter in Washington, summiting in London. He seemed to be moving towards an election, but then his marriage broke up, and any thoughts of a quick election were put aside. Both the Canadian and American economies were deteriorating now, and Trudeau went to Bonn for what was to be his last summit. He returned to shake up the government with spending cuts, to shake up his own cabinet, but he postponed an election. This spring, he went into his fourth campaign. There were two issues, he said. One was leadership, the experienced, proven international statesman, or a young kid who loses his luggage.
Say, Frank, if he goes to Tokyo as our prime minister, he'll come back and say, I had a great victory. You know, I gave President Carter the offshore mineral rights that he wants, and I gave the Europeans a better deals on our raw materials, and I've promised some more oil to Japan, and they all agreed with me. A great leader.
The other is the shape of Canada. Trudeau said he stood for strong central government, while Joe Clark would give too much power to the provinces. We'd end up, he said, with 5 strong regions and a central government too weak even to arbitrate.
I'm asking you to build with us a Canada where all the provinces have strong governments, where all the provinces are involved and none is neglected or set aside because it poses too difficult problems. but also a Canada where there is one national government that can speak for all Canadians and make sure that the wealth of this country is shared by all Canadians everywhere.
It was reminiscent of the One Canada theme a decade ago. And for the first time in his life, Pierre Trudeau lost.
But I think it is my duty at this time to recommend to my colleagues that we hand the government over, and that I recommend to the Governor-General that he ask Mr. Clark to form a government. Mr. Clark. Mr. Clark will know his duty and I take it he will want to seek the confidence of Parliament in good time. And as for me, I think I will be a pretty good leader of the opposition, surrounded as I am.
There's hardly ever been a Canadian political leader who generated so much emotional reaction as Pierre Trudeau, from adoration to hatred, from admiration to contempt. Larry Stout has been talking today to Trudeau friends and enemies about his decision to quit.
Mr. Trudeau's great contribution to Canadian politics has been his passionate belief that French-speaking Canadians, particularly those who live in the province of Quebec, but by no means only those living in the province of Quebec, should come to feel very much at home in their country, wherever they may live.